Welcome, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on this morning. Those are the Mattagami and Mattagami First Nations, where I am coming to you from, in the Treaty 9 territory. As we're meeting on a virtual platform, even in these discussions, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to affirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From across the province, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people. My name is Cameron Grant, Senior Policy Analyst for the Chamber, and I'm pleased to be joined in these discussions today. November 1st marks Treaties Recognition Week. This annual event honors the importance of treaties and helps students and residents of Ontario learn more about treaty rights and relationships. By learning more about our collective treaty rights and obligations, we can create greater understanding and nurture relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Treaties Recognition Week also represents one of the many steps in Ontario's journey of healing and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Launched in 2016 in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action to increase treaty awareness, it provides students and the public with an opportunity to learn with treaty matters to all Ontarians. Joining me today is Sue Prince, member of the Mattagami First Nations, and is also an Indigenous Relations Advisor for Ontario Power Generation. This conversation is meaningful as OPG is a pillar partner for the Chamber's diversity and inclusion within our Reimagined Resiliency series. Sue, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. And yourself?
I'm very well, and I'm really pleased to be joined with you today, of course, I believe you are coming at us from Treaty 9 territory as well.
I am.
That's excellent, and it's appropriate because today we're going to be discussing a little bit about the importance of Treaties Recognition Week and where that came from, how we got to where we are now, and where we need to look to on the future and on the horizon. So we're going to jump right into it, and I hope you don't mind me asking. So how do we define treaties? What is unceded land claims? And let's start with that question there. Let's get a little bit of background.
So treaties are legally binding agreements that set out the rights and the responsibilities and the relationships of First Nations and the federal and provincial governments. So essentially they're nation-to-nation agreements, and they cover such things as the creation of our reserves across Ontario, Canada, looking at historical use, so protection of fishing and hunting and harvesting rights of Indigenous peoples, and how we share that land going forward, and continue to practice our rights, our harvesting rights, uninhibited. It touches on education. So, treaties really cover a lot. Unceded land claims, well, that really refers to Indigenous communities that never ceded or legally signed away their lands under maybe a treaty agreement with the Crown.
That's excellent. And I know, so we talked a little bit about signing over land and this, that, and the other, but you did mention something quite important. And I think, if you don't mind, we'll touch on that, how the Indigenous peoples at the time of the treaty discussions foresaw the land. They weren't necessarily owners of it, but they were stewards. Could you expand a little on that?
Yes, Indigenous peoples, we have a very strong connection with the lands and the waters, and we didn't see it as an ownership, but as a responsibility, or as you said, a stewardship. We really, I think our ancestors at the time of the treaties were really looking at the protection, the living in harmony with, on the land and the waters. And that includes, the animals, the four-legged, the two-legged us, the swimmers and the crawlers and the winged ones. It was really about the ability to continue to live in harmony in a balanced way, and respecting each other's cultures.
And so, we're talking as far back as the War of 1812. We're talking, there is a vast component of our history here, which, many may not have delved into quite deeply. But, when we look at the beginning of the treaties, how were they conveyed? How was the language conveyed by the colonialists to the Indigenous people at the time, in your opinion?
So, when you go back to the 1900s, it was around the era of the Hudson Bay trading post. So I think there was some ability of the understanding of English or French or the indigenous languages of the day. But ultimately, the treaties, when they were presented to the indigenous communities, were presented orally. The First Nations weren't able to sit around and read, this treaty agreement with a lawyer beside them. It was interpreted to them by the commissioners. And when you translate from one language to another, you lose specific points, relevancies of words. So I don't really believe that a lot of the Indigenous communities fully understood or comprehended what they were signing on to.
And you know what, I think it's important that you do recognize, legislation these days is difficult for anybody to understand. And so even translating, as you had said, and conveying the important items within back then could lead to certain complexities to some of the problems that we have today. Obviously, at the time when the colonialists were feeling like they were accomplishing something by conveying the items within this treaty, there was also something very dark going on in this history, in this period of history, especially as Canada was looking at their own development. So can we talk a little bit about, some of the history of what those dark times were looking like in conjunction with these treaty signings?
Yeah, Canada does have a dark history that is just really coming to light and to the surface and being discussed, especially this year with the discovery of or recovery of Indigenous children under the guise of the residential schools. This did prompt the Truth and Reconciliation report to come about in 2015. There were 94 calls to action. I think, appropriate here for the Timmins businesses under the Chamber of Commerce. We talk about, if you look at Section 92 business regarding businesses and reconciliation, it's important as a business to ensure that you reach out to the local Indigenous community that your business may impact, and meeting consultation before proceeding with an economic development project, providing equitable access to the Indigenous peoples for jobs and training, education, in the corporate sector, considering long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. And especially kind of what we're doing here today, educating your staff and the managers on the history of Aboriginal peoples. Education is key, and it will definitely help your business and your relationship with Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples.
I think you're raising a very good point, and quite a natural segue from the past now to the present, and where we are, with several components and relations with First Nations and Indigenous people from a business community standpoint. And you touched on quite a few important points about, getting that education integrated into your workplace ecosystem and having those discussions. But in the spirit of this candid conversation, I'll share my own personal experiences that sometimes people feel a little bit worried or uneasy. We don't know how to approach, we don't know how to start that conversation with First Nations organizations. So is there a desired path to make those meaningful connections in your experience?
Yeah, well, I think, there's an abundance of resources for non-Indigenous peoples to find out on the internet. The Truth and Reconciliation report is there. I'm trying to think. There's just an abundance of resources. I know the schools are looking at incorporating more Indigenous history, or should I say, the actual history of Canada into the curriculum. But it's, there's in Timmins, the resources are abundant too. We have the Ojibwe and Cree Cultural Center. We have the Timmins Native Friendship Center, for examples. And starting a conversation with Indigenous peoples or communities, if you go in and approach a conversation or an introduction with kindness and openness, that doesn't really steer anybody too wrong. I know it can be very intimidating to start a conversation about a topic that is dark, as we said earlier, and not having a lot of knowledge of the area. But I think, you know, anything done in kindness goes a long way, and you just work hard at building those relationships.
And I think you framed it perfectly, you know, for even when I look back to my own public education, and that wasn't a call out to the public, but it was in the sense that, you know, history was looked upon through rose-colored glasses, and we're starting to scratch the surface of a period of enlightenment. And I look to our youth who are asking those questions, and it's a good step in the right direction. I think that, you know, the provincial government is especially recognizing that these need to be taught in our public institutions, and those conversations need to be had. It is the path forward for sure. So that was the present, Sue, and I appreciate your insight. But let's look towards the future. What on the horizon do, you know, business communities, or rather business leaders, owners, operators, are oftentimes looked to as leaders within our community, and sometimes needing to be the catalyst to you know, filter those conversations down to employees, clients, volunteers, etc. What, in your opinion, do business owners need to be looking to in the future as to not only educate, disseminate information, but build relationships, in your opinion?
I think I'm going to go back to, you know, resources available. So I think businesses, you know, to like in Timmins, need to reach out to you know, the local Indigenous communities around them. You know, with, you know, we are in the traditional territory of Mattagami First Nation, my community. You know, we have Waban Tribal Council office here, reaching out and talking to the communities or tribal council, introducing yourself, you know, providing information about your business or your goals, you know, asking questions, you know, and being open. Transparency, you know, is a wonderful thing. It doesn't, you know, if you go in honest and, you know, and very transparent about your business and your asks, usually, you know, that's a great way to start a conversation. You know, learning about what Indigenous businesses are out there that your company could possibly joint venture with, or secure an agreement with for material or services. It really, you know, it's really you, the individual person or business owner. You need to get out there and you need to start having those conversations, and finding those Indigenous businesses and communities and, you know, tribal council offices that you can engage in conversation with, and learn and educate yourself and build a relationship with.
And I think it's so important that you share that information, because, you know, when we look at building those relationships, and you really said it's about you making those first steps. And I think the defining word in that phrase is you. There is no national framework. There is no uniform consensus form that you can do. It really is about, and we know that the path to reconciliation is about building those individual relationships with Indigenous peoples and First Nations organizations that cannot simply be resolved by having some sort of national uniform framework. And so I really appreciate your comments today, Sue. Do you have any final comments or commentary that you wanted to share before we end the conversation?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank the Chamber for reaching out to me. You know, I provide a lot of education and support to Ontario Power Generation and other businesses that we work with. So it's really nice to have the Chamber reach out to me and talk, because this is my traditional territory through Mattagami First Nation, and it's important to me. Relationships are important to me. But I'd like to point out, you know, kind of highlighting, you know, I keep highlighting, you know, there's resources out there. You need to go and find them, educate yourself. I want to point people in the direction of Ontario Power Generation's website and our recently launched Reconciliation Action Plan. It's a high-level plan that, you know, that OPG has identified goals, commitments to working with Indigenous people, and a bit of a roadmap. It's a living document, so it's going to grow. It's based on our lessons learned. I've been with the company for 13 years and contributed to the document myself, and will continue to support it. But please go to our website and check out our Reconciliation Action Plan. Maybe it is something that a company here locally would be interested in taking on, and I would encourage it. It is at a larger scale than a smaller company might, but it would provide you definite examples of what your company might be able to plan for in the future with working with Indigenous peoples and building healthy and positive relationships.
So there you have it. I mean, resources exist, scalable or otherwise, and it's important that you reach out and begin to have those conversations. As key takeaways from this discussion, Sue Prince is a member of the Mattagami First Nations and an Indigenous Relations Advisor for Ontario Power Generation. Sue, I just wanted to extend a special thank you for these discussions today. They are extremely insightful, and I wish you all the very best, and thank you for joining us as we launch the national, provincial Treaties Week, and we're pleased to have this as sort of a catalyst to these discussions going forward. So thank you.
Yeah, miigwech.
Miigwech. All right, that was good.
Am I good to hit stop? It'll just
yes.
Okay.
Like I learned so much within that. You know, you read stuff, but you need to hear it. And I know, to me, like Indigenous people's storytelling is the best way to convey not only the teachings, but the desires and the needs and the wants. So when I hear it, it does become something living.